everyone, this is Sukanya.
And I'm Nishtha.
And we welcome you to yet another episode of Intersectional Feminism Desi Style, brought to you by Feminism in India.
Today's episode, I think, is an episode that is most special to me and is one that I have been most excited about. So when some of my earliest memories of anybody talking about documentaries was very singular. It was nature documentaries on Nat Geo. And I had very little interest in that. So for the longest time, as an art form or as a content vertical, documentary was something that I was just like, yeah, okay, I'm not sure if this is for me. And then I thank whatever supernatural powers are at play that good sense prevailed. And I realized that especially as an aspiring documentary filmmaker, that I have found that when we talk about real human stories, the emotions that they can elicit can sometimes have the power to affect us and tug at our heartstrings and make us feel a spectrum of emotions that are at times far more heightened than perhaps even fiction can, when what you can conjure up in a fictional world. So for me, really, especially in the past few years, documentaries have become the go-to, not just for, of course, information, but also for really feeling human emotions and being in touch with that, which is an aspect of documentaries that I think have been hidden from public for a very, very long time. And we have with us on this episode possibly the best person to talk about with this. So yeah, really, really excited for this episode.
We have with us writer, producer, and director Rintu Thomas. Her documentary feature, Writing with Fire, which documents the rise of Khabar Lahariya, India's only newspaper run by Dalit women, won the Audience Award in the World Cinema Documentary category at Sundance Film Festival 2021. Writing with Fire, as you all may know by now, is also nominated for the Oscars in the documentary feature section. It is our absolute pleasure and pride to welcome Rintu to this episode. Hi, Rintu. Thank you so much, and big congratulations on the Oscar nomination. Welcome to the episode.
Thank you, you guys. I'm very, very happy to be here. Very, very happy to be talking about everything that Nishta said at the top of the episode. I share very many of such experiences. So very, very excited to dive in.
Like we were talking about the popular perception that there was for documentaries, you'd mentioned in an interview that when you set up Black Ticket Films in 2009, at that point in time, sort of the overview of the way that this content genre was seen, that it was supposed to be very educational and not really, like, people weren't really coming to it for, I don't want to use the word entertainment, but let's call it infotainment for the lack of a better term. And yet you decided to go ahead with this in 2009, which was a while ago. So I just wanted to know, like, what was motivating you at that point? What were the kind of what was your thought process when you were like, no, like, let's just do this, let's do it, and then we'll see?
I went to Jamia for my master's. That was the film school, which in many ways I'd say transformed everything for me. And before I entered Jamia, I'd never seen a documentary in my entire life. It just sounded like a fun course, and looked at media through different kinds of lenses, traditional like puppetry and street theater, to all the way to sound and making documentaries and fiction. And I remember still the orientation day where everybody was sharing why had they chosen this course and what would they like to become. And a couple of students had said, I want to be a documentary filmmaker. And I remember thinking, who wants to do that? You know, why would they want to do that? And I think shortly 2 years later, I found my answers, because I was always, my interest was in writing. So I wanted to be a writer, features writer, a print journalist. I applied to ACJ and got through there. So that was the trajectory that I planned out for myself. But being in film school, I think I learned how to write with sound and images, and that was truly magical. My student documentary, which I co-directed with 3 other batchmates, including Sushmit, is a film called Flying Inside My Body. It's a short talk about Sunil Gupta, who's a photographer. He is gay and HIV positive, and he uses a nude form of his body to challenge ideas of shame, stereotyping of the human body. You disassociate identity from the body itself. And that was we had a blast. doing that. As students of film, we didn't have any kind of a set language. So people say your first film is always your truest film, and when we made it, it did quite well, won many student doc awards, traveled festivals. Just most importantly, got inducted into the curriculum of universities. And when invited my family to watch a screening of the film at a festival, I was a bit nervous because I come from a very traditional Christian sort of upbringing, and homosexuality is not something we spoke at home. And so I was very nervous about my father's response. And when we got back home, it's for the first time we had a conversation where he went like, yeah, those people are human beings too. So I think in many ways that film helped me have that conversation with my own father about accepting and respecting differences. And that just really blew my head, that the form of nonfiction has a very, very powerful kinetic energy, which from the moment you start conceiving of a film in your mind to the moment when it reaches somebody else's life, it's got a great deal of power. And so I freelanced for a year. I wasn't really sure if this is a great career move because, again, people didn't really get excited about watching documentaries. And that's when Sushmit, we were good friends. He said, "Why don't we start something on our own?" And I was like, "Are you kidding me? Who's going to watch? Who's going to fund documentaries in this country? Because we didn't have formal structures. Even the handpicked ones that used to be there would give like very little money." And then we thought, why not? You're young, give yourself a year. If nothing happens, shut shop. And that's how Black Ticket Films came into being in 2009, with the sole purpose of creating films that engage, that trust the intelligence of the viewer, that invite you into a world that you didn't know existed, but when you walk out of it, you're richer by the human experience of being there.
Rintu, now, when you were talking about your journey of deciding that you would like to make documentaries and tell stories, you also spoke about the human aspect of engaging with stories and different experiences of different people. So when we come to Writing with Fire, it's about Khabar Lahariya, and you have tried to document the journey of that institution and people who made it what it is. And when you come to that, Khabar Lahariya in itself is an institution, and there are so many aspects to that story about this institution that have to be told with a lot of empathy and sensitivity and grace, and also probably there without, I mean, not probably, definitely with a tone that's very non-appropriation, not, that's something that comes from a genuine space of wanting to tell a story and does not come from a space of saviorship or patronization or anything. So as a person, as a filmmaker, when you were engaging with the different layers of that story, when you were trying to tell that story, what was your biggest challenge, and what do you think was your biggest triumph in the process of making this film?
I think in terms of process, it remained quite similar to all my other work. I'm led with a sense of genuine curiosity, and as a nonfiction filmmaker, you're always telling stories that are not yours. You're always in realities that are not yours. In that way, you're always an outsider. In this case, more so because neither of us are Dalit. Our class separates us from the protagonist that we were documenting. And so I spend a lot of time in just introducing us. And I think it goes beyond the my name is. It really means like spending time, letting people to know who you are, expecting them to open their lives is I think the way to correct the inequity between the person behind the camera and the protagonist is to walk in with your vulnerabilities as well, and be quite honest about what is it that makes you curious. And the starting lever for Writing with Fire was a meeting that we were invited to, that Khabar Lahariya was having in their Chitrakoot office, where the entire team was discussing this shift from 14 years of print to digital. And that meeting was led by Meera, who's the central protagonist of the story. And that room that day was just heaving with so many different kinds of personalities. And one thing that stood out was the intellect of these women. They knew that they had a very sound foundation in Uttar Pradesh, such a contested landscape in every which way, and yet weren't having the reach that they wanted to. And with the very high penetration of internet and cheap smartphones, they knew that we had a captive audience. They just needed to expand. And on the other hand was this huge challenge of digital literacy, because most women had never touched a smartphone. So had this amazing dream and vision, and they were just they were going for it. And yet in the room was this sense of, how are we going to achieve this? This is nuts. This is never going to happen. So just being in that room, both of us made the decision that this is a story that we'd love to stay with. But actually, the decision to make the film, I think, would happen in the next 7 days that we spent with them, where we allowed them to, I would say, put us through a litmus test of sorts, where we accompanied them into the field. We were a very tiny crew. It was just the three of us, Sushmit, me, and Karan, a co-cinematographer. I doubled up as the sound recordist. Sushmit was directing and doing cinematography, because we couldn't have a giant team. We would stick out and in many ways interrupt the work of the journalists. So just being very as unobtrusive as possible, as invisible as possible, being extremely respectful with the distance that we maintained between us and the characters as they were doing their work. When we got access to their homes, being mindful of, just because someone's invited you home, you don't just start filming, or asking them the toughest questions, your curiosity going into all kind of layers of their lives. So just allowing allowing the time for them to trust us. And I think that's my biggest takeaway. These are media savvy women. These are such smart women. These guys are, their resilience is not something that I have actually come across that often in my own life. So for them to choose us to tell their story, which was going to be entirely independent, which was going to be having zero interference from them, because we wanted the editorial integrity to be with us. So just that process was we gave it the time that it needed, and very slowly you realize that trust permeates to different layers of filmmaking, and you reach a point where you're in the room with a camera, and yet, despite them being media persons, they sort of like allow the hyper, what is the word? How do I redraft that sentence? Allow themselves to be filmed in the way that we would like them to be filmed. So I think that was beautiful. There were many challenges, but I think just the crafting of the narrative, where the story is about women who pull a chair to the table and say it's our turn now to tell our story in our own voice. So to create a story that maintains that authenticity, where it's them telling the story without the filmmaking coming in the way, was a hard balance, because the authorial voice is mine, but the story is somebody else's. So that delicate balance was very hard. We spent a year editing the film, and to really arrive at the alchemy of, yes, it's a story I'm telling, but I am not being their voice. It's them, telling their own story. So it's I would say now in retrospect, a magical balance, but that took a long time to come into being.
So the name of the podcast is Intersectional Feminism, which is there's a lot of responsibility that even those words carry when we attach that to ourselves. And in that regard, especially in the media space, which is so homogeneous on editorial tables, and where, like, Sukanya's journalist, I'm a journalist, I see that it's usually a group of upper caste men who are making decisions behind newsrooms and shaping popular narratives. Khabar Lahariya is like Sukanya said, it's an institution in itself. Also on the importance of sort of opening up editorial spaces in our country for media to be more inclusive in the way that it decides to tell stories. Now, I was watching another one of your interviews that I think you had done on Delhi, which for our listeners was a film that you made in 2011 about the Commonwealth Games and how the beautification of Delhi was happening at that point in time, and how many people actually ended up losing schools and their homes, and what that beautification drive really meant for people. And I will segue to Fangirl here. Oh my God, what a film. But in that interview, you had mentioned that you wanted, so a documentary, of course, is a visual piece, but you wanted this to go beyond just being a visual piece. And then that film also ended up making it on the curriculum of universities abroad and ended up bringing in a lot of change and asking a lot of very important questions. So when we talk about a film being more than just a film, what are your hopes with Writing with Fire? What do you hope that it will translate into?
I want to actually start with what you said, and that which is actually the absolute beauty of Khabar Lahariya. What happens when you diversify the newsroom? When you have women from communities which are consistently invisibilized and made to believe that their life does not matter, when they reclaim that space and then decide that what is news making, who is at the center of a news story, and what happens to the sense of dignity and idea of citizenship of people that they stand up for when their stories are reported. You know, a little road being broken that goes to a tiny village is of zero importance to the kind of news that we consume. But that is the most important thing for a Khabar Lahariya journalist. And the way she approaches it is, if there's an accident, sure, it'll be a breaking news, which everybody will run, even in that landscape. But their approach is, sure, everyone's covered it, the news is out there. What we're interested in knowing is how much budget was sanctioned for this particular road. How much of that budget has been spent and where is the rest? Now, what was spent, why does this road keep breaking down three times every quarter? So that's really how I think you're also creating better viewers, better listeners, better news consumers. And that would remain for me Khabar Lahariya's biggest contribution amongst the plethora of things that they've done, where they're questioning what news is, but doing it in a suave way by doing it.
Right.
And I think that's really my hope for Writing with Fire. It's a highly intersectional film. And it is talking about, it sits at the intersections of caste and gender and media, and navigating patriarchy and populism, and all of it is in there. And it's all happening at a very particular moment in a very specific part of India. And yet it's resonating so powerfully across communities and viewers in the world. And there is a word that everybody keeps telling us when they watch the film is, I'm inspired. And that's the potency of change. That's the afterlife of a film. That's the legacy of a piece of art, where you can watch it divorced from its immediate reality and feel like I am inspired because this film is telling me something about these rural women who are up against every sort of structural power, but it's also telling me something about me and my society. So what do I take away from it? You know, so that's really what it would be. So, and with Delhi, it's very interesting because it was so impossible to put films out there at that time if it's not commissioned work. And it came from our fury and rage at the way the Delhi government was behaving at that time, invisibilizing people. And you realize governments change, but certain things don't, just become worse. And so this is 2011, before virality on social media could be bought. So we decided that it would be great if we put the film out there and people start sharing it. And just on a lark, when we were ready with the film, it's more like a visual essay than an observational doc like Writing with Fire. And I remember just sharing it with a few friends outside the country, within the country, saying, this is a film we made, we're just putting it out there, share if you like it. And overnight, it was like a wildfire. It just organically, people started tagging it, sharing it, pieces were written. You realize this is what young people especially want to talk about. This is our story. And this is what makes nonfiction, as you said, so much more powerful than any form of storytelling, because it's how you felt, is how I felt. And I found a language to put it out there, which you made it your own and sent it out further on. And that's why that film continues to live on. And one can only hope and dream that every nonfiction piece that's created has this beautiful afterlife, because 1,000 people reading a book is 1,000 books. So, I've made a film, but I hope that everybody absorbs it in a way which is beyond and above me.
So I have to ask you a technical question about Delhi. So that entire montage that you have where the child is describing where his school used to be, and then how flyovers came up and buildings came up and like roads started being constructed, and that whole, it's almost like an animated piece. And this is just me again fangirling, but I just wanted to know, how did you come to that imagery of it almost looks like a school kid's painting, and as the child is narrating it, it's almost like the kid is drawing what's happening around that child. Like, did you actually have a child draw that for you? Like, can you tell a little bit, like, tricks, if you could tell us how you went about that?
So when we went to the Dhobi colony, where we found these children and families started talking, and that colony was supposed to be knocked down anytime. And our initial plan was to film with the child. So we're talking to her family, etc. And as luck would have it, I came down with typhoid just like 2 days after we went there. So I was out of action. It was literally just Sushmit and me doing the whole thing. So we couldn't go back for a good 10-15 days. And when we did go back, the family had relocated, and the whole place, the way we remembered, was just rubble. So now we had you felt even more driven to tell the story. The idea of losing home, and Delhi is really about at the heart of that. Home, where does home exist when a majority of your adult life is outside of it, toiling for creating so-called development, which is never going to come to you.
Yeah.
And then fortunately we found this child and started talking to her, and I said, what happened? And this is exactly the way she described her, and so matter-of-factly, as if she was telling us a story about the government knocking her entire colony down, her home down. And so so I said, do you mind saying this for my sound record? And she was like, sure. So it was such a noisy place. We got into a car, shut ourselves in so that we could get clean audio. We got her audio, and then we were like, what's the visual on this one? So while the whole film was being edited, this particular part only had audio, and it lay there for a very long time.
So your timeline was black?
Black, it was just black. And then we thought it would be great to have an artist draw something. And so we put word out there, spoke to a lot of artists, but we wanted not the finesse, but the childlike beauty to the illustration, because it was a kid's narrative. And so we found this illustrator whose style was very much like that, thanks to Instagram, and then got her on board and just played this back on loop for her. So she drew it as she heard this. So two people who never met each other were telling a story that belonged to one of them. And that's how that came into view.
Speaking about documentary storytelling through a documentary as a medium, You spoke about how there are certain issues that young people would really want to prioritize and talk about how our realities are constantly about creating resources and, sort of facilitating a lot of things to happen in a more equitable, in a more just way, considering that we also inhabit a very developing country where the landscape is very different across different classes and social locations that people embody. So, as a viewer and as a person who consumes and engages with content, I just want to ask you that when we talk about Indian representation at international festivals, especially the Academy Awards, etc., it's always pedestalized, and generally West Eastern art in the West, there's always a problem with the gaze that that we observe as viewers. At least we feel that the Western gaze is almost always about highlighting the poverty or maybe the underdevelopment in the East. There's always that colonial sort of white man supremacy sort of a thing that plays out. And even when there is a one Parasite or some other documentary film or a feature film that's getting some sort of representation, then that is also becomes a sort of tokenistic thing. As a viewer, I've always felt this. And but I also understand objectively that the reality of the East, as a result of its history and other things, remains that we are mostly development facing countries, and we mostly have a dearth of resources, and we have a lot of problems that are rooted in social segregation and discrimination and compartmentalizations of different kinds. So as a creator, I just when you are telling these stories, and when you know that there has been international exposure, there's going to be international exposure, do do these thoughts affect your storytelling in any way? How do you look at this, and how do you look at validation from the West, and what according to you would be success, so to say, when everyone's saying, oh, Rintu's film is going to the Oscars? What do you feel? Do you have these thoughts?
Very, very wide question, and but I love it because I think it is referring straight to the entire politics that each of our films is imbued with, the gaze. Um, it makes me mad when I watch films by both Western filmmakers and Indian filmmakers that um, typify the Indian experience. And there is a model for an Indian woman who has to be either rescued from these really evil, so-called quote unquote evil forces within which she's like find herself trapped, or she's hyper, out of body, this superhuman person who's so extraordinary that there cannot be any parallels. And we've grown up watching and consuming this content and feeling completely disassociated by it. Even with Writing with Fire, the film's got like great reviews, right when it played at Sundance, all the trade and like the media really wrote very well about the film. But the Western media, there was one complaint, the critique of the film consistently, which was they don't explain. The filmmakers don't explain how Khabar Lahariya came into being, how are they financially supporting each other. They don't give us a history lesson on Khabar Lahariya. And I love it because that's precisely what I'm trying to do, not give you a PowerPoint presentation about Khabar Lahariya. You meet them and I meet them. Because the fact that we're explaining on a title card to you that this is the country's only Dalit, marginalized women, tribal women led news organization that has had 14 years at its back and it is now going to transition to print, you know whatever you want to know about what the context is. I'm not going to give you an ethnographic description of how horrible it is to be living in that part, being a woman journalist, where journalism is the prerogative of dominant caste men. My film is going to help you experience that. You will, at the end of it, I'm confident, feel what Meera feels every time she has to step out of her home and do this job day after day, when most times you don't see impact. And how can you be so invested in change? That's what the film is really about. So I'm not going to give you any easy explanation. I think that's the burden that we as especially filmmakers from South Asia carry, um, without being very consciously aware of it, where we have this pressure of explaining our culture, our context for the Western mind. And I stand in absolute opposition of it, because when I watch cinema, world cinema, and about, I don't know, a war somewhere, or a famine somewhere, or just Hollywood, most of the times I don't really truly know the context to the story, especially the kind of films that are set in the American Civil War, etc. But I'm here to, like, take me on a ride. I will pick up little cues that you are giving me, and for everything else there's Google.
Yeah.
So it's really about not wanting to put things as text and say, this is my country. I'm trying to simplify it for you, because while making the film, that's something that we were very conscious about. We don't want to oversimplify anything that counts as context for an Indian audience, and we didn't want to overcomplicate anything for an international audience. Here's a film, we will set it up in a way where it's easy for you to walk into the universe of the film, but there is no easy spoon feeding that's going to happen. And that's a stand that more and more Indian filmmakers are taking, because our styles of storytelling is very different. We come from very rich oral tradition of telling stories. We are not necessarily married to the 3-act, one amazing arc structure. And yes, there is an expectation in the West, because all your funding structures are there. And that's where their expectation of what is the storyline, what is the ending. And we had to really struggle the tyranny of those kind of proposals and pitches, because that's what the system is. But when a Writing with Fire, which is entirely directed and produced by an Indian crew, reaches an Oscar shortlist without a studio or an OTT platform or a big white producer, we've already changed that narrative. And I think that is what, when people congratulate, and I truly believe when I say that when one of us walks across that door, it's open for all of us. And we really hope that not every time, we have to reinvent the wheel of, will this film be ever made? And that's something that we all deal with a lot, because you start off a film, it's self-funded, you have no idea what the storyline is going to be. As you said, there could be 100 stories about Khabar Lahariya that can be created, because it's such a fertile space of what they're doing. But to really pin down on what is my story, and for to commit to bring it out as a very eloquent pitch is very hard. Nobody believed in us. The film was pitched consistently to Indian producers. Nobody touched the film. So it's really about standing in the power of why you do this work. What is my philosophy of doing this work, which is to really amplify the work of people who exist at the margins of society, and from there creating silent revolutions. That's really my point of doing all the work. So I hope that this film being on the big O radar opens up many more conversations about us telling our own stories in the language that we want to say.
You were talking about the tyranny of structures where you pitch stories, and this whole process of documenting where you have to accentuate your synopsis to make sure that somebody else in some other landscape and other cultural setting who has money is interested in this, or even somebody who has that sort of resources in your own country is interested in this. And you also spoke about what inspires you to keep doing the work that you do. Now, even we as women journalists, also as journalists who work with an independent feminist media organization, it's it's an everyday thing, unfortunately, for us to feel defeated and disappointed against the lack of resources, against the lack of acceptability, against the kind of trolling and the kind of hate that comes our way, especially considering the political landscape of our country. It's very difficult to find make peace with these innermost confrontations between, how am I going to keep doing this vis-a-vis why do I want to do this? So amidst this all of these experiences, I just wanted to ask you, how do you negotiate these innermost, monologues that you may have about, oh, this is such a flawed system and I want to do this, but I'm also exhausted. Do you ever feel exhausted? I mean, how do you navigate? Where do you find your support system? How do you find it in you to keep doing this?
It's very lonely. And that's the hardest part. Some days you feel you've walked 10 steps and the next day you know that it's gone like 20 steps behind, because to create a film, to run an organization that it's independent and feminist like yours and Khabar Lahariya, support doesn't come easily, criticism does. So I think there have been many times in the process of even running Black Ticket films where we've had projects, months where lots of projects are there and you can expand the crew and do the kind of work that you're doing, and months where there is no work. So just being, I think it's hard. It's very, very hard. But I think what I have learned is you need to have a kick-ass team, people who believe in you and who you believe in. So even on the crappiest of days can be, the troopers that you need, because there needs to be a collective for all of us to move forward. It's exhausting to do it alone. And secondly, to believe that this matters, that in the long run is going to burn me out completely and I'm on my own, but this work means something. And it might not be possible for me to fight the structures that are so apparent and evident, but it's possible for me to create an alternative structure of power. And that, I think, are the two things that have learned to remind myself on an everyday basis, which keeps me going. I'll just give you a very small example. Friendicos, this animal shelter home in Delhi, was shutting down a few years back, and we read about it in the newspaper, and everybody was heartbroken because such an institution in itself, they were being evicted, they didn't have money, so they said, we're going to just shut down. We shared this with our team during lunch, and everybody just went like, everyone was an animal lover. So everyone just went like, can we do something? And just over that lunch, we decided, sure, let's reach out to Friendicos. And we met them and said, what do you need at the moment? We can't give you money, but what do you think can support you? And they said, people need to know who we are, what being alive really means for us, and how they could support us. So in a matter of, I think, 3 to 4 days, the entire team at Black Ticket Films created a campaign. We went there, we shot with, the staff, the dogs, and just day and night, we just put together to create a small campaign. It was called Make a Friend. I think it was called #MakeAFriend. That was the campaign. In a week, we put it out there. So this was just a week before they were supposed to shut down, and it just blew the internet. People shared the thing, and we had a whole strategy around it, change your profile picture, la, la, la. And in a week, they had double the amount of funds that they needed. And Friendicos is back up and about. The whole movement sort of got galvanized to write a letter to the Delhi government to allow them to stay, etc. So legislatively, one was able to put some pressure, but all of it because, a bunch of people decided to do something together and with zero resources said, what can we do? And I think that really is where all of us are standing up, learning from each other, leaning on each other, uplifting each other, and especially women-led organizations. We need more of those because our gaze is missing from the mainstreaming of stories that happens. Where do we watch films about women-led institutions? Where have we seen, what is the point of reference of women's friendships on screen? You have a Dil Chahta Hai, you have a Zindagi Na Milegi Dobara, you have all these, references, but what do we have as women's friendships? Nothing. It's usually in the realm of negativity. Women can't stand each other because it's, when and that is again something that we viewed Writing with Fire with. Women who are bosses, as colleagues, as friends, as sisters, who are compassionate and soft, but not weak. They are strict and firm, but at the heart of all of it is let's lift each other up.
So, Ritu, like we're coming to the end of the episode, and one thing that we've actually realized is that the way that content consumption patterns have changed with the advent of OTT is something that's really boomed in the last 3 or 4 years. So, for instance, regional cinema is getting more visibility now, as opposed to just sort of Hindi dominating what mainstream used to be. You now have regional cinemas reaching more homes, reaching up north, solely because of the fact that now OTT has come in, and the traditional ways of consuming content have changed. You don't have a prime time slot on TV anymore, or you don't have to always go to like cinema halls that are playing 6 screens with like botched up subtitles and things like that. So that shift we also see is happening with documentaries to some degree, like say a series like House of Burari suddenly just, or Wild Wild Country just explodes and everybody's watching it. So my final question to you is, what is one documentary recommendation you have for our listeners? What's something that you saw that you loved, that you think everybody should watch because it was just so great? What's your top doc recommendation right now?
It's an older one called Thin Blue Line by Errol Morris. It's a documentary which transformed the language around truth, seeking truth, because there's a crime that's happened, and it's my favorite genre. So crime has happened, and there's a perpetrator and there's a survivor. And it's set in stone before Errol Morris sort of like delves into the film. And then he excavates this, all the literature, the legal literature around the case, and the testimony of these two people themselves. And Errol Morris invents a whole new technology to actually shoot the film, looking straight into the eye of his interviewees. And I think it continues to have a very, very strong impact on me, because it really is about one thing I'm very, very interested in, is what is exactly truth, and what is story, and where do both of them interlace, and where do they depart from each other. It's beautiful when we are making films, that relationship between truth and my truth versus yours, and fact and reality. And that is such a powerful, eloquent, smart film. And I think anyone who watches it will walk away from it getting richer. So definitely Thin Blue Line.
Yes, so just like that, we've come to the end of this episode. And, in retrospect, and in conclusion to this episode, what I think what I would take away from this conversation is about, Rintu, how you spoke about how documentary filmmakers are always in other people's realities, and how you're always the other, and how you know that you're telling the story, but it's not your story. Yet you are also in a space of being driven by genuine curiosity. I think that that statement it embodies everything that intersectional politics and the spirit of storytelling stands for. And that's something it's so layered a thought. I'm still, sort of processing those things, that inner process of yours as a storyteller. And so I'm so grateful to you. We're so thankful to you for being on the show and speaking to us with so much tenderness and so much insight and so much respect for the voices that you try to amplify right through your work. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure talking to you.
Oh, please stop thanking me. It's been a pleasurable 40-50 minutes. And, there's a joke between Sushmit and me where he says, you don't know how to contain your thoughts. So what he says in 3 lines, I say in 30. My writing style is also that. So I think you guys were at the receiving end of that today. But thanks for having me.
But
Absolute pleasure.
those conversations are always the most wonderful ones. So just like this one, also such a wonderful conversation. I'm like too hyped right now, but to our listeners, thank you so much for listening to us. We will be back next to next Thursday with the season finale of Intersectional Feminism Desi Style Season 2. We can't wait for you to hear it. So as always, thank you for listening and tuning in.